I woke up one morning to the sound of loud knocks on my door. When I opened it, I did not see a neighbor or a delivery driver. Instead, I saw a notice slapped right onto my front door. The paper was bright yellow, and in bold letters across the top it read violation. I froze for a second. My eyes moved from the notice to my yard and back again. I already knew what this was about. My garden, my pride and joy, the rows of vegetables I had planted, the flowers blooming in colors that painted the air, the herbs I used for cooking, and the small trees I had nurtured from saplings. To me, it was a sanctuary. To the HOA, it was unauthorized. As I tore the notice off the door, I could feel my heart racing. 10 days, it said. 10 days to remove everything or face fines that would stack up until I complied. They thought I would roll over. They thought I would dig up every plant and throw away months of sweat, time, and care. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I looked over my garden that morning, the dew sparkling on the leaves, the smell of earth still fresh from last night's watering. And I made a decision right there. If the HOA wanted a war over my garden, they were going to get one. But I was not going to fight them with destruction. I was going to fight them with creation. Because if they thought my little garden was unauthorized, they had no idea what was coming next. So stick around, because what happened after that shocked the entire neighborhood, turned my life upside down, and changed the way everyone saw the HOA forever. And if you love stories about standing up to impossible rules and fighting back against unfair power, then make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because this is just the beginning. My name is Daniel Carter, and for most of my life I dreamed of having a home where I could grow something real. I grew up in a small apartment in the city where the closest thing I had to a garden was a tiny pot of mint on the windowsill. My parents used to laugh when I would water it every morning like it was the most important thing in the world. As I got older, life became busy. College, work, moving from one cramped place to another. But that dream of having land, of touching the soil and seeing something come alive because of me, never left. I promised myself that one day I would buy a house with a yard big enough to finally make that dream a reality. That day came 2 years ago. I signed the papers on a modest house in what looked like a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The price was fair, the streets were lined with trees, and the backyard was wide and empty, nothing but grass waiting to be transformed. I remember standing in that yard for the first time, holding the keys in my hand, and imagining rows of vegetables, beds of flowers, and maybe even a little fountain. For the first time, I felt free. Of course, the neighborhood had an HOA. I knew it from the beginning. They sent me a packet of rules when I moved in. Pages of what you could and could not do. Paint colors, mailbox designs, lawn heights. Honestly, I barely skimmed it. I thought as long as I kept my front yard neat, they would leave me alone. The backyard was private, after all. That was my mistake. I threw myself into the work. Every weekend, every evening after work, I was outside. I built raised beds out of wood. I tilled the soil, I planted seeds. At first, it was just a few herbs and tomatoes. But then came the sunflowers, the lavender, the berry bushes. By the end of the first season, my backyard looked like something out of a magazine. It was full of life, buzzing with bees, glowing with colors. Neighbors began to notice. Some would stop by to compliment me. A woman down the street brought her kids over to see the sunflowers. An elderly man told me the smell of lavender reminded him of his childhood. These moments made me proud. My garden was not just for me anymore. It was becoming part of the community. But not everyone felt that way. I started to notice the looks. The long stares from certain neighbors. The disapproving shakes of the head. I brushed it off at first. People will always have opinions. But then came the letters. The first one was folded neatly and placed in my mailbox. It said my garden was not in compliance with neighborhood standards. I laughed it off, thinking it must have been a mistake. I ignored it. Then came the second letter, more serious in tone. Then a third. They claimed my raised beds were unapproved structures. They said I needed permission to plant anything more than grass. They even suggested my garden was lowering property values. It was absurd. My garden was hidden in the back, not visible from the street. It was neat, organized, and well kept. How could that lower anything? But I could feel the tension building. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. Some neighbors waved. Others glared. The garden had become more than plants. It had become a symbol. The HOA made it clear. If I did not get approval, they would take action. It first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I should just go through the process, ask for approval, keep things simple. But then I thought, why should I need permission to grow food? On my own land? Why should someone else decide if I can plant tomatoes or roses? I kept going, watering, planting, expanding, and then one morning, I walked outside and saw that bright yellow violation notice taped to my door. 10 days. It said 10 days to destroy everything I had built. 10 days to erase the dream I had waited my whole life to create. That was the moment I realized this was not about a garden. And I was not about to surrender. After the violation notice, I knew the HOA was not going to back down. 10 days was all they gave me, but I was stubborn. I refused to touch a single plant. Instead, I doubled down. I watered more carefully. I pruned every branch. I made the garden look more alive than ever before. The HOA did not like that. On the 5th day, another letter arrived. This one was not polite. It listed fines that would begin immediately if I did not comply. $50 per day, it said, until every unauthorized structure and plant was removed. I stared at that line for a long time. $50 a day meant $1,500 a month. They were not just threatening me. They were trying to financially crush me. Then came the phone calls. I did not even know how they got my number. But they did. A stern voice would leave messages saying I had been warned, saying legal action would follow, saying the board would not tolerate my refusal. I tried to talk to them. I showed up at one of their meetings, thinking maybe if they saw me in person and understood what this garden meant, they would show some compassion. I sat in a small, stuffy room with a long table at the front where 5 board members stared at me like I was a criminal. I explained how I was growing food, how my neighbors loved it, how it was healthy, how it made no sense to destroy it. They listened with blank faces. Then the president of the HOA leaned forward and said that rules were rules. If I wanted to live here, I had to follow them. They claimed my garden was attracting pests. They claimed the smell of compost was offensive. They claimed that the sight of raised beds was disruptive to the uniform look of the neighborhood. I knew then that this was not about real reasons. This was about power. They were flexing their authority, and if they let me get away with it, then someone else might get ideas too. After that meeting, the harassment grew worse. I started noticing cars slowing down in front of my house. People I had never spoken to were snapping pictures of my yard. A neighbor I once chatted with suddenly refused to make eye contact. One evening, as I watered the tomatoes, I heard voices behind the fence. They were talking about how I was going to lose, how the HOA always wins. Felt like the walls were closing in. Every day, another notice, another letter, another threat. They wanted to wear me down until I broke. But the more they pushed, the stronger I felt. I was not just protecting a garden anymore. I was protecting the idea that a person should have control over their own home. Still, I had to admit it was exhausting. Some nights I lay awake wondering if they would take me to court. I wondered if they could put a lien on my home. I wondered if I was being reckless, if I should just tear it all down and avoid the stress. But then, the next morning, I would step outside and see the garden glowing in the sunlight, hear the bees buzzing, smell the lavender in the air. And I would remember why I started this. The HOA thought they were winning, but what they did not realize was that all this pressure, all this harassment, was forging something inside me. Plan. An idea that would take their rules and turn them inside out. An idea that would not just save my garden, but turn it into something much bigger. At that point, I did not know exactly how it would happen, but the seed of rebellion was planted. And soon, it would grow into something the HOA could never have imagined. The fines started hitting my mailbox like clockwork. At first, it was one slip of paper, then another, then a whole stack. Each one had the same cold language.
$50 owed.
Balance increasing. Immediate payment required. They were trying to drown me in debt before I even had a chance to fight back. I kept the letters in a shoebox in my closet. At first, I thought I would need them as evidence later. But after a while, I realized I was also keeping them as fuel. Every time I opened that box and saw the pile growing, it reminded me that this was not just about vegetables or flowers. This was about standing up to something bigger. Neighbors started to show their true colors. Some became my allies. The family across the street came over with cookies one evening and told me they loved how my garden made the block look alive. An older woman stopped by with a smile and said she walked past my yard every morning because the flowers brightened her day. But others turned cold. One man muttered under his breath that I was ruining the neighborhood. Another woman, who used to wave at me when I walked by, now crossed her arms and glared if I so much as stepped outside. It was like the HOA had planted suspicion and anger in the soil of the community, and it was starting to grow. The pressure was not just social. It was financial. The fines were adding up faster than I could believe. $1,000. Then $2,000. I did the math and realized that if this went on for months, I would be buried under debt. And the HOA knew it. That was their weapon. They did not need to tear out the garden themselves. They would just bleed me dry until I gave in. I thought about calling a lawyer. I thought about going to court. But lawyers cost money too, and the HOA had endless resources. I was just one person, and yet, something inside me refused to back down. Every time I looked at the tomatoes climbing higher on their stakes, every time I saw the sunflowers tilt toward the sky, I felt stronger. One evening, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, I did not go to plead my case. I went to listen. I sat in the back as they talked about budgets, landscaping, and paint approvals. When my name came up, their tone shifted. They spoke about me like I was an enemy of the state. One board member said if they let me keep my garden, others would start breaking rules. Another said they needed to set an example. I realized then that they were not just trying to stop me. They were trying to make me a warning, a cautionary tale for anyone else who dared to step out of line. When I left that meeting, I felt two things at once. Fear because I knew they were not stopping, but also clarity. If they wanted me to be an example, then I would be one. Just not the kind they expected. The stress was heavy. Some nights I would sit at the edge of my bed, staring at the shoebox of fines, wondering how long I could keep going. But then I would step outside in the morning, walk between the rows of plants, and feel a calmness that nothing else in my life had ever given me. The garden was more than food and flowers. It was a piece of freedom in a world of restrictions. And as the HOA tightened their grip, my mind began to wander. What if I could turn this garden into something more? What if I could turn it into something they could not touch? Something that would not just belong to me, but to everyone? That thought stuck with me like a seed in my brain. It was small at first, but it began to grow. I did not yet know how I would do it. But I knew this. If they wanted to destroy my garden, I would make it so big, so important, and so loved that destroying it would be impossible. The breaking point came one morning when I walked outside and found not just a notice on my door, but an actual inspector from the HOA standing in my yard. He had a clipboard in his hand, a sharp suit, and a look on his face like he was there to deliver a death sentence. Without even asking permission, he walked the perimeter of my garden, writing notes, shaking his head, measuring things with a tape. I asked him what he thought he was doing. He said he was documenting violations for the record. He said the raised beds were too tall. He said the trellis was an unapproved structure. He said the compost bin was an environmental hazard. His words were sharp and clinical, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to build a case strong enough to take me to court. That day shook me. For the first time, I realized they might actually succeed in crushing me. Not because they were right, but because they had power. They had money, authority, and the system on their side. And me? I was just one man with a garden. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the stack of letters and the fines that were now in the thousands. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but it sat untouched as I stared out the window at the rows of plants swaying in the evening breeze. I asked myself a hard question. Was it worth it? Was I fighting for something foolish? The stress was getting to me. I was losing sleep, losing focus at work, and every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be another threat from the HOA. My friends told me to let it go. Some of my neighbors told me to just give in, pay the fines, tear it down, and move on. but the thought of ripping up every plant with my own hands felt like tearing out my own soul. One night, I decided to take a walk. I wandered down the street, past rows of cookie-cutter houses with their perfectly trimmed lawns. No flowers, no gardens, just sterile green squares that all looked the same. I thought about how much life my garden brought, how it buzzed with bees and butterflies, how it smelled of lavender and basil, how it gave me food I could eat with pride. And then I realized something. The HOA saw my garden as a threat because it was different, because it broke their illusion of control. And maybe that was exactly why it mattered so much. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the idea hit me like lightning. If they thought my garden was unauthorized, if they thought it was just mine, then what if I made it more than mine? What if I made it something that belonged to everyone? I imagined a space where neighbors could come and walk among the flowers. A place where kids could learn how food grows, where families could pick vegetables, where elderly neighbors could sit on benches and enjoy the smell of roses in the breeze. If I turned my garden into something for the community, then destroying it would not just be destroying my property. It would be destroying a public good. The thought filled me with energy I had not felt in weeks. Suddenly, the fear of fines seemed smaller. Suddenly, the intimidation seemed weaker, because now I was not just defending a garden. I was planning a transformation. Of course, it was not going to be easy. I would need support. I would need to rally neighbors. I would need to outsmart the HOA at their own game. But for the first time, I felt like I had a path forward. Over the next few days, I started making quiet moves. I talked to the neighbors who had supported me before. I asked them what they thought about turning my backyard into a shared garden space. Some of them lit up immediately. One man said his wife would love a place to grow flowers. Another family said their kids would be thrilled to help plant vegetables. An older woman said she missed gardening but could not manage the physical work on her own anymore. Every conversation planted a seed of its own. Slowly, I realized I was not alone in this fight. My garden had already become a small community without me even noticing. All I had to do was take that next step and make it official. But the HOA was still circling. The fines kept coming. The threats grew louder. They wanted me to feel cornered, desperate, ready to give in. What they did not know was that their pressure was doing the opposite. It was pushing me toward an idea so much bigger than they could ever control. The breaking point had come, but instead of breaking me down, it had built me up. I was done being scared. I was done feeling small. I was ready to take the fight to them in a way they would never expect. The HOA wanted to shut down my garden. But soon, they would realize that they were not just dealing with a garden anymore. They were dealing with a public park in the making. After the breaking point, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. For weeks, the HOA had made me feel like I was playing defense, just reacting to their threats. But now I finally had a strategy. My garden was going to become something bigger than myself. Something they could not touch without looking like villains in front of the entire neighborhood. I started planning in secret. Every evening after work, I would sit at my kitchen table with a notebook and draw sketches. I imagined walkways winding between flower beds. I imagined benches where neighbors could sit under shade trees. I drew out sections for vegetables, herbs, and fruit bushes. In one corner, I even sketched a little play area for kids. Something simple with wood chips and a swing. At first, it felt like I was just daydreaming. But then I asked myself, why not? Why could this not be real? If the HOA wanted to control me, I would show them something they could not control, a movement. But I knew I could not do it alone. I started reaching out to people carefully. One Saturday afternoon, I invited my neighbor Tom over for coffee. Tom was the kind of guy who always waved when he saw me outside, the kind who had quietly told me he admired my garden but never got too involved. I told him about my idea of turning the backyard into a community space. His eyes widened and then he smiled. He said it was the best idea he had heard in years and promised to stand with me. That little bit of encouragement gave me momentum. I talked to Mrs. Hernandez down the street, the retired teacher who had mentioned she missed gardening. When I told her she could have her own little patch of soil, she nearly cried. She spoke about how her late husband used to love growing sunflowers, and how planting them again would make her feel closer to him. I spoke with the Johnson family too. They had 3 kids who spent most of their time indoors with video games. When I explained the idea, their kids lit up with excitement. One of them wanted to grow strawberries. Another asked about pumpkins for Halloween. Their parents smiled at me and said they loved the idea of their kids learning where food really comes from. Little by little, the network grew. Quiet conversations, one by one, planting seeds not in the soil but in people's minds. And the best part was that the HOA had no idea what was happening. To them, I was just one stubborn homeowner refusing to give in. They did not see the allies gathering quietly around me. But it was not all smooth sailing. Not everyone was on board. One neighbor shut the door in my face the moment I mentioned the word garden. Another said she did not want people tramping around the neighborhood like it was a farm. A few told me they did not want to get involved because they were scared of the HOA. And honestly, I could not blame them. Those rejections stung. But they also reminded me of something important. This was not going to be easy. I had to build not just a garden, but trust. I had to show people that this was not only my dream but could be theirs too. Meanwhile, the HOA kept tightening the screws. I got another letter saying I owed nearly $5,000 in fines. They threatened to place a lien on my house if I did not pay. They warned me that further violations could result in legal action. It was meant to scare me, and for a moment it worked. The thought of losing my home was terrifying. But every time I looked out my window and saw a butterfly land on a marigold, every time I smelled the mint growing along the fence line, I knew I could not give up. So I doubled down on my secret planning. I created a schedule. Step 1, rally enough neighbors to support me. Step 2, organize a quiet meeting to make the plan official. Step 3, start transforming the space. The first big step came on a Friday evening. I invited a handful of the neighbors who had already shown interest to come over for a barbecue. Nothing formal, just burgers, music, and laughter in the backyard. But halfway through the night, once everyone was relaxed, I brought out my notebook. I spread it open on the picnic table and showed them the sketches. The response was overwhelming. People pointed at the drawings and added their own ideas. Someone suggested a butterfly garden. Someone else suggested a rainwater collection system to keep the plants watered. Another neighbor offered to build a wooden bench with his own tools. For the first time in weeks, I felt the heavy weight of isolation lift from my shoulders. I was not alone anymore. I had a team. We agreed to keep things quiet for now. The HOA did not need to know what we were planning until the time was right. We called ourselves the Garden Circle. It was simple, but it gave us a sense of identity, like we were part of something bigger. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my backyard under the stars. The garden looked different. It was not just rows of plants anymore. It was a battlefield, yes, but also a future park, a sanctuary, a place where hope lived. The HOA thought they were fighting me, but what they did not realize was that a community was quietly forming under their noses. A community that would soon be too big, too loud, and too united to ignore. And I was ready to lead it. The Garden Circle had given me hope, but hope alone would not stop the HOA. We needed action. We needed to turn the sketches in my notebook into something real. And so we planned our first secret workday. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was just starting to rise when I walked outside with a shovel in hand. The air was cool, the kind of quiet where you can hear every bird chirp. One by one, my neighbors began to arrive. Tom showed up first with a toolbox slung over his shoulder. Mrs. Hernandez came carrying a basket of seedlings she had been growing on her windowsill. The Johnson kids ran up the street, laughing, carrying bags of soil their parents had bought the night before. Felt like the start of something powerful. We were no longer just talking about a park. We were building it. We worked quickly and quietly, careful not to draw too much attention. The kids helped carry bags of mulch. Tom began building the frame for a bench. Mrs. Hernandez gently placed her seedlings into the earth, whispering the names of each flower as she planted them. I dug rows for vegetables and showed the kids how to plant strawberry runners. Every time I looked around, my heart swelled. This was not rebellion anymore. It was creation. It was community. It was people coming together in a way the HOA would never understand. But with every swing of the shovel, I felt the weight of risk. We all knew the HOA would not stay blind forever. Someone was bound to notice. And sure enough, by midday, the first sign of suspicion appeared. Car drove by slowly. It was one of the board members. He did not stop, but his eyes lingered on the yard longer than usual. My stomach tightened. I knew he would report back to the others. We kept working, but there was tension now. Every sound of tires on pavement made us glance up. Every passing neighbor could have been an informant. Still, no one stopped. If anything, the unease only pushed us to work harder, to finish more before the HOA could act. By late afternoon, the transformation was already visible. The bare patches of dirt were now green with new life. The frame of the first bench stood proudly under a tree. A small section of the yard had been fenced with wooden posts, creating a little corner for herbs. When the sun began to set, we gathered around to admire what we had done. It was only a fraction of the full vision, but it was enough to prove the dream was possible. I could see pride on every face, and in that moment I felt certain we could win. But the victory was short-lived. The next morning, I found another letter stuffed into my mailbox. This one was not like the others. It was sharper, more direct. The HOA said they had received reports of unapproved construction and community activity taking place in my yard. They demanded an explanation. They threatened immediate legal review if I did not stop all unauthorized projects. It was clear now. They knew. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in my hand. My coffee went cold as I read it again and again. The HOA had been watching us. Maybe it was that board member who drove by. Maybe another neighbor had tipped them off. Either way, the clock was ticking. That afternoon, I called a quiet meeting of the garden circle. We gathered in my backyard, sitting on overturned buckets and makeshift stools. The mood was different this time. Less celebration, more seriousness. I laid the letter on the table and let everyone read it. There was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, people began to speak. Some said we should stop, at least for a while. Others said if we backed down now, the HOA would win. Mrs. Hernandez put her hand on the letter and said we had already planted too much to let it die. The debate went on for nearly an hour. Fear versus determination, risk versus reward. In the end, we made a decision. We would not stop. If anything, we would push harder. The only way to win was to make the garden so undeniable, so essential to the neighborhood, that the HOA would look like the enemy for trying to destroy it. From that day forward, our workdays became regular. Early mornings, late evenings, weekends. We moved fast, always careful, but always moving forward. More neighbors joined us, some quietly, some boldly. The park was growing. And so was the tension. Because while we were building a dream, the HOA was preparing their next move. It did not take long for the HOA to make their next move. Just a few days after our secret workday, I found a thick envelope taped to my front door. Inside was not the usual fine notice. This was an official warning letter drafted by their lawyer. It used heavy words like cease and desist, injunction, and non-compliance. They were not just threatening anymore. They were preparing to drag me into court. Reading that letter made my stomach churn. For the first time, the possibility of losing everything felt real. They were not bluffing. They wanted to crush me not just financially, but legally. They wanted me to feel powerless, like resistance was impossible. I spent that night pacing my living room, the letter spread out on the coffee table. I thought about what could happen. A lawsuit, thousands of dollars in legal fees, a lien on my house. The nightmare scenarios ran through my mind, one after another. For a few hours, I seriously considered giving up. But the next morning, when I stepped outside and saw the Johnson kids already kneeling in the soil planting more strawberries, something inside me shifted. They were smiling, laughing, covered in dirt, proud of what they were creating. And in that moment, I realized that this fight was no longer just about me. It was about everyone who had joined me. If I quit now, I would not only lose my garden. I would let down every person who had put their faith in this dream. So I decided I would not give up. Of course, the HOA did not stop with letters. They began sending inspectors past my house more often. Men in polo shirts with clipboards, jotting down notes every time they drove by. Sometimes they would park across the street and sit in their cars, pretending to be on the phone while staring at my yard. It was intimidation, plain and simple. Neighbors started to notice too. Some grew nervous. A few even pulled out of the garden circle, afraid that they would get dragged into the fight. I could not blame them. Fear is powerful, and the HOA knew exactly how to use it. But others became more determined. Tom built a bench in secret and carried it over at night so no one would see. Mrs. Hernandez planted more flowers along her fence line, making her whole property bloom in solidarity. And the Johnson kids began drawing little signs that said things like "Community Garden Forever" and "Keep Our Park Alive." They stuck them into the soil like flags of resistance. The HOA tried another tactic. One afternoon, I came home to find a notice posted on my front door saying that I was in violation of property maintenance codes. They claimed my yard was overgrown, unsanitary, and unsafe for children. It was laughable. The garden was cleaner and more organized than half the properties in the neighborhood. But that did not matter. They were not enforcing rules. They were manufacturing excuses. I knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to paint me as a troublemaker, someone reckless, someone who endangered the community. That way, if they ever went to court, they would have a story to tell. But here is the thing. They underestimated me. Instead of hiding, I started documenting everything. I took photos of every corner of the garden. I filmed the kids planting, the neighbors sitting on benches, the butterflies dancing across the flowers. I kept every letter, every notice, every threat in a folder. If they wanted a fight, I was going to make sure the truth was on my side. At the same time, I began thinking bigger. The HOA could try to silence me within the neighborhood. But what if I took this fight outside of their walls? What if I told the story to the world beyond these streets? I started small. A few photos posted online. A short description of how my neighborhood was trying to shut down a community garden. The response was immediate. People loved the idea of standing up against unfair rules. Comments poured in from strangers saying they supported me, that I should keep fighting. A few even offered advice from their own battles with HOAs. For the first time, I realized that this was not just a local fight. It was part of something larger. A struggle between ordinary people and the rigid systems that try to control them. And that thought lit a fire inside me. Still, the pressure at home was intense. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every time I saw a board member drive by, I felt that old fear rising again. But I kept reminding myself why I was doing this. For the neighbors who believed in me. For the kids who saw the garden as magic. For the community that deserved something better than rules and fines. The HOA had lawyers, money, and power. But I had something stronger. I had people. And people, when they stand together, can be unstoppable. The battle lines were drawn now. The HOA had made it clear they were ready to use every weapon they had. And I had made it clear that I was not going anywhere. The next move would be theirs. And I had a feeling it was going to be big. The threats and intimidation from the HOA kept coming. But something else was happening too. The garden was growing faster than their power to stop it. Every day the space looked less like a single homeowner's backyard and more like a true community park. And people were noticing. It started with small gestures. A neighbor walking her dog would pause to admire the flowers. Someone on the next street over stopped by to ask if their kids could come help water. Then one afternoon, I came home to find a basket of seeds left on my porch with a note that said simply, "For the garden." No name, no explanation, just quiet support. Momentum was building. But the real turning point came when the community decided to go public. It happened almost by accident. One Saturday morning, the Johnson kids invited a few of their school friends to join them in planting. Word spread quickly, and before I knew it, there were more than a dozen children running through the rows, laughing, carrying watering cans, and proudly sticking their little handmade signs into the soil. Parents came too, some bringing snacks, others bringing tools. The backyard was buzzing with energy. And then someone took a photo. By the end of the day, that photo was online. A wide shot of kids kneeling in the dirt with smiles on their faces. Behind them a garden full of color. The caption said, "Neighborhood HOA wants to destroy this." The reaction was explosive. Comments flooded in. People were outraged that a simple garden could be under attack. Strangers offered to donate seeds, soil, even money. Local pages started sharing the story. Suddenly, our small fight was being watched by hundreds of people who were rooting for us. The next week, more neighbors showed up. Some who had been afraid before now wanted to be part of the project. They saw that the garden was no longer a liability but a symbol of standing up for what was right. We organized our first official community gathering. Nothing huge, just a Saturday afternoon picnic in the garden. Families brought blankets, food, and music. People played games, shared stories, and admired the progress. Felt like the neighborhood had been reborn. For the first time, people who had lived next to each other for years were actually talking, laughing, connecting. But of course, the HOA was not happy. They sent another letter accusing me of holding unauthorized events on the property. They said gatherings were disruptive and against neighborhood policy. But this time, something was different. When I showed the letter to the garden circle, no one flinched. Instead, they laughed. Because we all knew the truth. The HOA could call it unauthorized, but to us, it was community. The real shift came at the next HOA meeting. I walked in expecting the usual cold stares and scripted threats. But this time, something new was waiting. Several of my neighbors came too. They sat in the audience beside me, silent but present, their support impossible to ignore. When the board tried to paint me as a rule breaker, my neighbors spoke up. One by one, they stood and shared what the garden meant to them. Mrs. Hernandez spoke about how it gave her purpose and connection after years of loneliness. The Johnson parents spoke about how their kids were learning more in that garden than they ever did in a classroom. Even Tom, who usually kept things simple, said that the garden had brought life to a neighborhood that had been stuck in rules and restrictions for too long. For the first time, the board did not have the last word. Their threats sounded weaker, smaller, compared to the real voices of the people sitting right there in front of them. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something shift deep inside me. The balance of power was changing. The HOA still had money, lawyers, and official papers, but we had something stronger. We had a community that was no longer afraid. The following weekend proved it. More people than ever came to help. Some brought plants, others tools, and a few even donated benches and garden decorations. What had once been a quiet backyard project now looked like a true park. There were flowers blooming in every corner, rows of vegetables reaching toward the sun, children's laughter echoing through the air, and neighbors sitting side by side on benches they had built together. And then it happened. A local reporter showed up. Someone had tipped them off about the fight between a community and their HOA. They walked through the garden, took photos, and asked me questions about why I was doing this. I told them the truth. This garden is not about breaking rules. It is about creating a place where people can connect, where families can grow food, where neighbors can come together instead of staying strangers. The next day, the story ran online and in the local paper. Suddenly, our fight was not just a neighborhood issue. It was a public story. People in the city, people miles away, were now watching. And they were on our side. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. The HOA could still try to scare me with papers and fines, but every threat they made only made them look worse. The garden was no longer just mine. It belonged to the people, and the people were ready to defend it. The turning point had come. We were no longer fighting from the shadows. We were standing in the open, united, visible, and stronger than ever. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. The HOA would not back down quietly. They had lost control, and that would only make them more desperate. The biggest battles were still ahead. The article about our garden had gone out to the world, and the response had been overwhelming. Friends, strangers, even local businesses were reaching out with encouragement and offers of help. For the first time in years, our neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses. It was alive. But with every victory came a shadow. The HOA wasn't finished. In fact, the more we won hearts, the more desperate they became to crush us. It began subtly. Small inconveniences at first. Letters threatening larger fines. Notices taped to my door claiming violations for things that had never been violations before. My garbage can was misplaced by 6 inches. My mailbox was painted the wrong shade of black. Even my fence, which had stood untouched for years, was suddenly deemed structurally non-compliant. It was laughable at first. Transparent attempts to bury me in paperwork and stress. But as the days passed, the pressure grew. They weren't just targeting me anymore. Mrs. Hernandez found a notice in her mailbox warning that her unsanctioned garden activities could lead to disciplinary action. The Johnson family received a threatening letter about their kids trespassing in my yard. Tom got a fine for parking improperly, even though his car hadn't moved in days. It was clear. The HOA was trying to divide us, to make my neighbors too afraid to stand beside me. But instead of weakening us, it only pulled us closer. We began sharing every letter, every threat, every notice. At first, it was just venting frustration, but soon it became strategy. We documented everything, photos, dates, copies of every ridiculous claim. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, we were ready to expose them. That's when they escalated again. One morning, I woke up to find the garden vandalized. Rows of plants uprooted, decorations smashed, soil scattered across the lawn. My stomach twisted as I stood there, staring at the destruction. It wasn't kids playing a prank. It was deliberate. Someone wanted to send a message. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Neighbors poured out of their homes, shocked and angry. Mrs. Hernandez cried when she saw her flowers torn from the soil. The Johnson kids stood frozen, staring at the crushed rows of vegetables they had planted with their own hands. That was the HOA's plan: break our spirit, make us give up. But they underestimated something. That night, instead of retreating, more neighbors than ever showed up. People brought lights, tools, and seeds. Some who had never participated before came to help rebuild. Together, we restored what had been destroyed, and by midnight, the garden was alive again. Bruised but alive. Stronger. And we weren't quiet about it. Photos of the destruction and the rebuilding spread online. People were furious. They didn't just see a garden anymore. They saw a community being bullied by a handful of power-hungry board members. The HOA had crossed a line, and now they looked less like enforcers of order and more like tyrants. But the board wasn't done. At the next meeting, they announced new amendments to the rules written specifically to shut us down. No agricultural activities within neighborhood limits. No unauthorized gatherings on private property. No structures such as benches, birdhouses, or trellises without prior approval. They were rewriting the book just to erase us. But here's the thing, they weren't subtle about it. Everyone knew exactly who these rules were targeting. And instead of scaring people, it made the board look even more desperate. Neighbors who had once been silent now whispered openly in the crowd, shaking their heads, muttering about corruption. Still, the pressure was real. Lawyers started sending letters. They threatened lawsuits, liens on my home, even forced removal. The language was cold, legal, terrifying. And I'll admit, there were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd gone too far. Was it worth risking everything for a garden? But then I'd look outside my window. I'd see the lights twinkling in the garden. I'd hear the faint sound of laughter from kids playing, neighbors talking, people living. And I knew this wasn't just about plants. It was about people reclaiming their right to community. The HOA thought they could wear us down with fear. But fear only lasts so long. Eventually, it turns into anger, and anger into resistance. So we pushed back harder. We began holding open garden days, inviting not just neighbors, but people from surrounding communities. We created a social media page documenting everything, from the joy of planting to the harassment we faced. And every time the HOA tried to silence us, we amplified our voices louder. The story was no longer local. It was spreading citywide. Other neighborhoods with strict HOAs began reaching out, telling us they were inspired by our fight. We weren't just defending a garden anymore. We were becoming a symbol, and that terrified the HOA more than anything. because they weren't just losing control of one community. They were losing control of the narrative. The battle was intensifying, and everyone could feel it. Something big was coming, something that would either break us completely or change everything forever. We didn't know it yet, but the next move would be the most dangerous one of all. The garden had survived vandalism, fines, threats, and rewritten rules. But the HOA wasn't backing down. They wanted total control, and when intimidation failed, they took the fight somewhere even darker, into the courts. It started with a letter delivered by certified mail. Thick paper, bold black lettering, words that cut deep even before I read them. The HOA was filing an official lawsuit. They claimed I was in violation of neighborhood bylaws, that I was lowering property values, that I was disturbing the peace. They demanded not only the removal of the garden but also reimbursement for damages. They said I had caused the association. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in my hands, reading it over and over. My chest felt heavy, my palms sweaty. This wasn't just a notice anymore. This was real. If I lost, I could face massive fines, liens on my home, maybe even foreclosure. All because I wanted to grow food and flowers in my own yard. Fear hit me like a wave. For a moment I thought about giving up, tearing out the garden, walking away. But then I looked at the photographs on my fridge. Smiling kids holding up baskets of tomatoes. Neighbors laughing under the sunflower arches. The newspaper clipping that called us a beacon of community spirit. That garden wasn't mine alone anymore. It belonged to all of us. So I made a decision. If they wanted to fight me in court, then I would fight them in court. The first step was finding help. I didn't have thousands of dollars lying around for a high-powered attorney. But when word spread about the lawsuit, something incredible happened. A local lawyer, someone who had been following our story online, reached out and offered to represent me pro bono. He said this wasn't just a case about a garden. It was about freedom, community, and standing up against abuse of power. With him on my side, I felt a little less alone. But the battle was still terrifying. The day of the first hearing, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer and a handful of neighbors who came to support me. My heart pounded as I stepped through the doors. The HOA board members were already there, dressed sharp, sitting stiffly with their own legal team. They didn't look at me. They didn't have to. Their smirk said enough. Inside the courtroom, the fight began. The HOA's lawyer painted me as reckless, selfish, someone who was destroying property values with an unsanctioned farm. They used words like nuisance, hazard, and eyesore. They claimed neighbors were miserable because of me, that the community was falling apart because of my refusal to follow the rules. It was hard to sit there, listening to strangers twist my intentions into something ugly. Then it was our turn. My lawyer stood tall and calm. He spoke about the garden as more than plants. He described how it had become a community hub, how it encouraged togetherness, health, and joy. He presented photographs. Kids planting seeds, neighbors laughing together, people gathering at sunset in a space that had once been just grass. He even had statements from neighbors who were willing to testify that the garden had improved their lives. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, neighbors began standing up. Mrs. Hernandez, the Johnsons, Tom, others from the street. They had come and they weren't afraid. They spoke about what the garden meant to them. They described the beauty, the food, the friendships that had grown out of it. The courtroom, which had felt cold and formal, suddenly filled with warmth and emotion. The judge listened quietly, her face unreadable. When everyone was finished, she leaned forward and said something that I will never forget. She told the HOA that while bylaws were important, they were not above the spirit of community. That rules designed to protect a neighborhood should not be twisted into weapons to harm it. She didn't dismiss the case entirely. Legal battles never end that quickly. But she made it clear that the HOA's claims weren't as solid as they thought. Instead of a quick victory, they were in for a long, messy fight. For the board, it was a blow. For us, it was hope. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and strength. We hadn't won, not yet. But we had shown them that we wouldn't be intimidated. Not in meetings, Not in the streets, not even in the courtroom. The fight was far from over. The HOA was angry, humiliated, and more determined than ever to shut us down. But so were we. The garden was alive. The community was stronger. And the whole city was now watching closely to see what would happen next. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This had become a symbol of resistance. And from that point on, every step of the battle would only get bigger. After that first courtroom battle, the HOA thought they could still grind me down with money, lawyers, and endless paperwork. But what they didn't expect was that every strike they made only fueled our story. And soon, it wasn't just our neighborhood watching anymore. It started with local reporters. They had been following our garden story since the vandalism incident, but once the lawsuit became public record, the headlines grew bigger. Neighborhood garden versus HOA. Community spirit on trial. The media framed it as a battle between ordinary people and a faceless system of control. One evening, a TV crew showed up outside my house. They wanted to interview me to capture the story in my own words. I stood in front of the garden, nervous but determined, and told them why we were fighting. I spoke about how this was never just about vegetables or flowers. It was about people being allowed to shape the spaces they live in. It was about freedom. The next day, I turned on the news and saw my face on the screen. And just like that, our fight was no longer quiet or hidden. It was out in the open for the entire city to see. With that attention came something I hadn't expected. Support from outside our neighborhood. Messages started flooding in. Strangers emailed me, thanking us for standing up. Families from across the city drove over just to visit the garden. Some brought seeds. Others brought food. A few even brought handmade signs that said things like, "Let the garden grow." And then, something even bigger happened. The city council got involved. At first, it was just one council member who stopped by, curious about all the buzz. She walked through the garden, met the neighbors, and listened to our story. I could see the look in her eyes. It wasn't just interest, it was conviction. She told us that spaces like ours were exactly what the city should be protecting, not tearing down. Soon, other officials began to pay attention. They couldn't ignore the press, the people, the voices rising louder every day. What began as one small conflict between me and the HOA was now being discussed at city meetings. Some officials argued that homeowner associations needed stricter oversight, that communities had the right to spaces like ours. The HOA board hated it. You could see the panic in their eyes at the next meeting. They tried to act like everything was under control, but their grip was slipping. For years, they ruled quietly in the shadows, writing fines and enforcing rules without anyone questioning them. Now the spotlight was on them and they didn't like how it felt. But if they thought the pressure would make us back down, they were wrong. It only gave us more strength. We began organizing more events in the garden. Not just casual gatherings, but official ones, public workshops on composting, lessons for kids about plants, even small concerts. The garden wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. One Saturday, over 100 people showed up for a community potluck in the garden. Families brought food, musicians played, kids ran through the rows of sunflowers. For hours, the space was alive with laughter and joy. Felt less like a yard and more like a festival. And when photos of that day spread online, people started calling it exactly what it was: a public park. That label stuck. It became a rallying cry. Our garden wasn't just my private project anymore. It had transformed into something much larger, something that belonged to everyone. And the city was starting to see it the same way. The HOA, of course, doubled down. They filed new motions in court. They sent more threatening letters. At one point, they even tried to hire private security to monitor the garden, claiming they needed to ensure safety. But by then, it was too late. Every action they took only made them look worse. Because here's the truth. When people rally around something good, something pure, it's nearly impossible to crush it. And our garden had become that symbol. A symbol of resistance. A symbol of hope. A symbol of what happens when people stand together against unfair power. As more weeks passed, I began to realize that the fight was no longer just mine. I wasn't leading it anymore, it was leading itself. The community had taken ownership of the garden. Neighbors watered it when I wasn't home. Kids protected it like their own. Strangers who had never spoken to me before were suddenly invested in our cause. The turning tide was clear. The HOA could keep fighting, but they were now fighting against more than one person. They were fighting against an entire city, maybe even something bigger than that. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if a simple garden could shake the foundations of an HOA, imagine what else could happen when people realized how much power they truly had. The garden had gone from a quiet act of defiance to a citywide movement. What started as me planting a few vegetables in my yard had now grown into something the HOA could no longer contain. And they knew it. The cracks in their control began to show. Meetings that once ran with tight order turned chaotic. Board members argued with each other in front of everyone. Some wanted to push harder against us. Others whispered about stepping back before things got worse. The pressure was splitting them apart. And it wasn't just inside the meetings. Neighbors who once feared the HOA were now standing tall against them. I started hearing stories from across the community. One family refused to repaint their shutters, saying if the garden could stand, so could they. Another neighbor stopped paying a fine for leaving his basketball hoop outside. People who had been silent for years were suddenly questioning everything. The HOA wasn't used to being challenged. They weren't used to being questioned at all. Their authority had always rested on fear of fines, fear of legal threats, fear of being singled out. But when the fear disappeared, so did their power. And in our neighborhood, fear was disappearing fast. One evening, we held another open event in the garden. This time, it wasn't just neighbors. People from all across the city came, curious to see the place that had caused such a stir. There were so many visitors that cars lined the streets for blocks. Kids played games between the rows of flowers. Musicians set up near the benches. Families shared food under the hanging lights we had strung across the yard. As I stood there, watching hundreds of people enjoying what we had built, I felt something shift. The HOA had always tried to convince us that rules were more important than people, that order mattered more than joy. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter and life, it was clear who was really winning. The board tried to counter. They called emergency meetings, sent out angry emails, even accused us of turning the neighborhood into a circus. But every complaint they made only made them sound bitter and petty. The more they lashed out, the more ridiculous they seemed. Then came the breaking point. At one particular HOA meeting, the room was packed. Not just with board members and homeowners, but with neighbors, reporters, even a city council member who had come to observe. Tensions were high. The board launched into another speech about violations, control, and the supposed dangers of the garden. But this time they were met with silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of disbelief. And then, slowly, people began to speak. One neighbor stood up and said the garden had brought more good to the community than the HOA ever had. Another said she no longer felt alone because of the friendships she had formed there. Parents spoke about how their kids learned responsibility and teamwork through planting. An elderly man talked about how the garden gave him a reason to step outside every morning. Voices rose one after another, until it wasn't just a handful of people speaking. It was nearly the whole room. The board sat frozen, their authority slipping through their fingers. For years, they had ruled with fear, but now the people were speaking with something stronger than fear: unity. By the end of the meeting, the crowd was chanting. Not angrily, not violently, but with energy and conviction. Let the garden grow. Let the garden grow. The board tried to adjourn, tried to gavel the noise into silence, but it was too late. Their control had shattered. In the days that followed, resignations began trickling in. One board member quit, saying she couldn't take the pressure. Another stepped down after being confronted by angry neighbors. The once ironclad HOA was collapsing from the inside. And as they crumbled, the garden only grew stronger. We planted more flowers, expanded the vegetable rows, added benches, paths, even a little stage for performances. What had once been my private act of rebellion was now a fully recognized public space, built and maintained by dozens of hands. The HOA wanted to destroy me by isolating me. Instead, they created a community stronger than anything they had imagined. Looking back, I realized something important. They had never really been fighting me. They were fighting the idea of freedom. The idea that people should have a say in how they live, how they gather, how they grow. And that's a fight they could never win. Because rules can be written, rewritten, and enforced with paper and threats. But people, once united, are unstoppable. The HOA was crumbling, and in its place, something better was rising. The HOA was falling apart, but desperate people do desperate things. Even with board members resigning and the community turning against them, a small core of diehards refused to let go of their power. They were not going down quietly. It happened on a warm Saturday morning. The garden was full of life. Kids playing, neighbors chatting, music playing softly in the background. That is when a group of men in uniforms showed up. Not police, but contractors hired by the HOA. They arrived with trucks, tools, and orders to tear down the garden once and for all. For a moment, panic rippled through the crowd. Were we really about to watch months of work and years of dreams ripped apart in front of our eyes? But then something incredible happened. People did not scatter. They stood their ground. Neighbors formed a line at the edge of the garden, shoulder to shoulder. Parents, kids, seniors, everyone. Mrs. Hernandez, who could barely walk some days, stood at the very front, clutching her cane like a staff. Tom crossed his arms and planted his feet. Even the Johnson kids linked arms, their faces determined. The contractors hesitated. They were not expecting resistance. They were not expecting to see a whole community united like that. And just as the tension was about to snap, reporters arrived. Cameras flashed. Microphones appeared. The story was already big, but this was the kind of moment news crews dream about, ordinary people standing up to injustice in real time. With the cameras rolling, the HOA's last attempt at control crumbled. The contractors backed off, saying they could not continue under these conditions. The crowd erupted in cheers, and the HOA board members who had orchestrated it all slipped away, their power finally gone. It was not just a victory, it was the final stand. From that day forward, the garden was untouchable. Not because of laws or paperwork, but because it had become something far greater than the HOA's rules. It was protected by people, by community, by love. And the recognition did not stop there. The city council officially declared the space a community park. They even provided small grants to help us maintain it. What began as a fight for my right to grow vegetables in my yard had transformed into a public landmark, a place for everyone. I will never forget the first time I saw the new sign installed at the edge of the space. It did not say unauthorized garden. It did not say violation. It said community park. As I stood there looking at it, I thought back to the beginning. To the first seed I planted, the first letter the HOA sent, the first fine, the first threat. Back then, it felt like I was fighting alone. Back then, I thought I was just trying to protect my yard. But standing there in the sunshine, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and families laughing in the park we had built, I realized something. The HOA had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had created something they never intended. A stronger, united community. The garden was not just mine anymore. It never really had been. It belonged to everyone. And as the kids ran through the flowers, and as music floated through the air, and as people gathered together with joy instead of fear, I knew one thing for certain. We had won. Not just against the HOA. Not just against rules and fines. We had won against the idea that control matters more than community. Against the idea that power belongs only to a few. The garden was alive. The people were free. And nothing could ever take that away. After the final victory, life felt lighter. The HOA was no longer a shadow hanging over us. Neighbors who once barely waved now stopped to talk, share food, or even help with planting. The garden had changed everything. I watched as kids who used to sit indoors came outside every day. Families gathered under the trees for picnics. Strangers became friends. Even people from nearby neighborhoods visited just to see what we had built together. For me, it was more than a win against the HOA. It was proof that one person taking a stand could spark something bigger. I had started this fight for my own little garden, but I ended it with a park that belonged to everyone. Looking back, I realized that the HOA had given me a gift without meaning to. Their pressure pushed me to create something greater than I ever imagined. The garden had become a symbol of freedom, community, and hope. And as I walked its paths one evening, hearing laughter and music around me, I smiled knowing this was only the beginning. The fight for my garden was over, but my story with the HOA was not finished. Because when people in power lose once, they do not always disappear. Sometimes they come back even stronger. And that is exactly what started to happen. Rumors began to spread about new rules, new fines, and a new board forming in secret. It was clear that the HOA was not done with me yet. But I was not afraid anymore. I had learned that when you stand your ground and when a community comes together, no rule or threat can truly control you. Still, I could sense that another battle was on the horizon. A bigger one. One that might make this garden fight look small in comparison. And if you think this story was wild, wait until you hear what they tried next. Thank you for spending this time with me and being part of my journey. Your support keeps me going, and there are so many more stories I need to share. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter in my war with the HOA will shock you even more than this one. The garden was only the beginning.